This is going to be a 9-video series on What If, 1 video per episode. In case you don't know the main concept of the show, it's showing us alternate timelines where one thing different happened, leading to some major differences down the line. Many people brush off the continuity errors or implications by saying, it's not canon, it's just a what if scenario. But these episodes are branches off of the main timeline, so everything is the exact same except for the one change and the resulting changes from that. Think of its capacity for damaging the main timeline like what happened in Loki. Sure, our main timeline Loki was not directly affected by the show, but it assassinates him by telling us what he would do if put in these scenarios, which is often stupid, and his personality flips from watching a video, as well as providing new underlying reasons for what he did that damage him as well. Anything that happens in What If is of the same nature. It doesn't directly affect our main timeline character, but it can show us what they would do in this situation or give us underlying information about them, therefore damaging them despite not being in the main timeline. I'm going to be referring to situations like this as assassination by proxy. Also, any plot problems are going to be treated the same way, of course. Now without further ado, let's get on to the first episode of this awful show. The intro to each episode of the show is the watcher explaining the premise, and the thing that annoys me about it is the use of the word realities. Realities is another useless word to drop onto the jumbled mess of what is dimensions, timelines, and universes in the MCU. It's extremely unclear what the difference between all of these are, or if some of them are the same thing. So for clarity, I'm going to be referring to these so-called realities as timelines, because that's what they are. Are timelines different from dimensions and universes? We don't really know, but that doesn't matter in the context of this show. As the show goes on, I'm going to keep a tally of characters that are out of character and characters assassinated by proxy. I'm only going to count significant characters though, not random goons. After the intro, we get a very brief recap of Captain America: The First Avenger, and the watcher says the events of that movie included
saving this universe,
which is a bit dramatic. The immediate follow-up to the statement is,
but in another universe.
So we already have inconsistent terminology from the watcher. Fantastic! I will still be referring to them as timelines. Steve and Peggy talk as they overlook where the super soldier technology is, but this didn't happen in The First Avenger. They walked up, everyone went silent, then Steve walked down. So already there's continuity errors, but this one is insignificant at least. And we know it should be exactly the same as The First Avenger because right after this, when Erskine asks Peggy if she would be more comfortable in the booth, she says,
"No, I prefer to stay."
And the watcher cites this specific moment as creating a new timeline.
There, that's the moment that created a new universe.
There's a lot of minor continuity errors like this, but I'm just going to refer to the ones that either have significant effects, or I find to be worth talking about for other reasons. Like this one, where after she says this, she walks away with all the other people here to watch. But in The First Avenger, all these people were already up at the booth. This is entirely necessary for the plot to happen the way it does, so that's a pretty big problem. These people shouldn't be allowed to be here anyway. The booth exists for a reason. You can't just let it go unused by some of the most important people in the United States when standing down here presents a risk. It's so stupid that these people are willing to stay down here and Erskine doesn't delay the experiment or force them to go into the booth before he actually starts it. They're dealing with an insane amount of electricity here, and any number of things could go wrong. Hence why they have a booth in the first place. So we'll count Erskine as our first character who is out of character, because the one significant decision he makes in this episode is uncharacteristically stupid. Not that these people should be down here at all, because they were already in the booth in The First Avenger. Wait, so now the bomb is in a conspicuous position and nobody notices or questions it? This is a bad position to put it in. Somebody is gonna see it. If it's gonna be this conspicuous, people are gonna find out anyway, so why not throw the bomb right before you detonate it so that nobody has a chance of seeing it before it's too late? Well anyway, the Hydra agent detonates the bomb, but the way he detonates it is different. In The First Avenger, he opens the lighter then presses it down. Here he just flips it open. I know this is a nitpick, but seriously, how hard is it to get that right? So the bomb explodes and Peggy just survives, as does Colonel Phillips and the Hydra agent. How? That explosion was massive, and everybody else seems to have died, but they somehow survived. Unluckily for Colonel Phillips, the Hydra agent, while running towards Steve, randomly turns around and shoots him. Somehow the shot was accurate, despite the Hydra agent having turned around right before he shot and not having any time to take aim. Peggy is upright and standing behind him and yells, yet the Hydra agent just turns around and starts running towards Steve again. He shoots Steve and grabs the serum, but when he turns around, Peggy is there pointing a gun at him. Why didn't she shoot him sooner? She had a lot of time to, yet she waited until after her friend was shot and the serum was grabbed. When she does shoot him, he conveniently falls in a way so that the vial of serum doesn't break. Peggy runs over to check on Steve, then Stark says that the power levels are dropping, so they need to do the process now. Flynn somehow survived the explosion as well, and orders people to go into the machine, arguing with Stark about him going in. And in the middle of that argument, Stark says,
"We're gonna lose everything. It has to be now.
and,
We won't get another shot at this."
which aren't exactly good things to say when you're arguing why you shouldn't go in. Peggy decides to go into the machine, and Flynn tells Stark not to do this, which is insanely stupid as Peggy is your only candidate for going into the machine right now. Flynn has appeared before in the Agent Carter one-shot, and he was misogynistic, but not to the point of stupidity. He wouldn't waste this one chance they have just because their only option is a woman, and she's definitely a better candidate than Stark. Because of this stupid conversation, we'll add Flynn and Stark to the list of characters who are out of character, and they continue to be stupid throughout the episode as well. Howard isn't particularly stupid as far as characters go, but compared to how smart he's supposed to be, he's in stark contrast. And by the way, all the scientists, even the ones who are far away from the explosion, are just gone. I don't know where they went, and in the first Avenger they were helping while Steve was in the machine, so I don't know how Stark could get it to work on his own, especially when part of the room got blown up. When Steve went through the process, he was screaming in pain, and I know Peggy is stronger than Steve, but there's no way she wouldn't make a single noise when this is happening if Steve was going through that much pain. Peggy asks,
Did it work?
when it's pretty obvious that it did. Then we cut to Peggy's blood getting drawn and Flynn ranting about what just happened, where he says,
I was promised an army.
except he wasn't. Phillips is the one who asked for an army, as he says in the first Avenger.
I asked for an army and all I got was you.
If Flynn had said, we were promised an army, then sure. But it's not like Flynn specifically was promised one. It was Phillips who asked for it, and thus Phillips is who it was promised to. Then the rest of the conversation is Flynn just being a one-dimensional misogynist. How lovely. But there's a specific detail here that is important, as it makes the entire episode fall apart. Peggy is getting her blood drawn so they can figure out how to make more of the super soldier serum because...
Every last drop of that Dr. Erskine serum went into you.
except it didn't. Remember in the first Avenger, when the Hydra agent ran off with the serum after the process? Which he was only able to do because there was one more canister of the serum? But when Steve chases after him, it eventually results in losing it, meaning all the serum is gone now. But that didn't happen here. There is still one canister of serum you could use to replicate it, and Stark is still alive, so surely, given the serum, he could figure it out. So the entire reason there was only one Captain America, the reason an army of super soldiers couldn't be created, therefore making the one super soldier special, doesn't exist. Peggy shouldn't be the only super soldier in this timeline. They have more of the serum, so they can just replicate it. Because you missed this, your story doesn't work. But sure, let's continue on and keep acting like all the serum is gone. We then see Peggy training, and somehow Steve is still alive. So Phillips died to the gunshot, but extremely skinny Steve with all of these health problems survived it. Sure. He says,
Nice left hook.
despite her last punch being with her right hand, and she gets angry about Flynn and throws a weight into the wall to show all the needless property damage she's causing. And it's here where Steve says that it could be worse, because she could be on a USO tour.
Wear a crazy costume, being told to smile 10 times a day.
But in the first Avenger, he says,
This is not how I pictured getting there.
so he clearly didn't expect for this to happen, even though he was told he couldn't fight in the war. So why would he now see it as a possibility worth bringing up? They talk about people fighting for them and bring up dancing, which we will get to later, but Steve shouldn't be this comfortable talking to her anyway. He has a hard time talking with Peggy,
You have no idea how to talk to a woman, do you?
I think this is the longest conversation I've had with one.
even after becoming a super soldier.
You still don't know a bloody thing about women.
Then we move on to Hydra, who, under the leadership of Schmidt, are taking the Tesseract? Wait, Hydra had the Tesseract before Steve became a super soldier. They would have had it long before this point. The Hydra agent arrived in a submarine, about which Howard says,
I don't know what's inside this thing or how it works.
so it has to be Tesseract powered, right? Because he's one of the greatest technological minds on the planet. There's no way it's not Tesseract powered if he doesn't understand what's inside of it. Especially because the Tesseract is found before that point in the first Avenger. So it makes no sense that the Tesseract is being gotten this late. And the Tesseract being gotten this late is entirely necessary to how the episode plays out in multiple ways. despite it being an impossibility due to it happening before the one change, and because the Hydra agent arrived in a Tesseract-powered submarine. The wall also looks different, which we'll talk about later. We then go to Peggy, Flynn, and Stark talking about getting the Tesseract before it reaches Berlin. Stark says,
Greatest minds alive.
before Peggy cuts him off to say,
And Stark is one of them.
which doesn't fit into his sentence and also just interrupted him in the middle of what he was saying. It was just a very strange time to say that. Stark says it again and finishes this time,
The greatest minds alive can't fathom the extent of this battery's power.
when just earlier he said,
What they were looking for could power London for a century.
so clearly you can fathom the extent of its power. And Flynn's response is,
Good. Who knows? Maybe the war will be over before Hydra figures out how to turn the damn thing on.
which is not a valid response, because Stark just said that the extent of its power can't be fathomed, not the ability to use it. But Stark just accepts this, and we cut to the next scene where Stark and Peggy are in a bar, and Stark shows Peggy her USO tour turned battle uniform, and shows her the shield by palming it from the top and lifting it onto the table. Not only is it fairly heavy as we see from the impacts it makes when thrown, but it also isn't even close to round enough for him to grab it like this. But now that she has her uniform, she can go into battle with no training with this shield at all, so we jump into an action scene. We see that the Tesseract is being transported by a few cars and some motorcycles, with Zola holding it. What? The most important thing you have in your possession is being transported with this little security? And Schmidt isn't here for what reason? Where are the tanks? Why isn't it being transported in a plane for safer and faster travel? This idiotic decision is what allows Peggy to come after the Tesseract in the first place. Also, they were estimated to be halfway, if not 2/3 of the way to Berlin.
That thing must be halfway to Berlin by now.
More like 2/3 of the way.
So how did Peggy get ahead of them? Even if this was plausible, it's only because their method of transport is so slow. If it was by plane, she wouldn't have any method of transport fast enough to overtake them. Not that she really should have been able to here anyway. So she knocks out the driver of the bike at the front, then we see this. What? She threw it that far, with that much accuracy, at a moving vehicle, with no training? And it came back perfectly? Why do this anyway? Shouldn't you be throwing your shield at the farthest forward car as your first move? Because stopping that one would give you the greatest chance of making the others run into it, therefore using your element of surprise to its fullest potential? Instead you did something you need no surprise for and just gave away that you're ambushing them. Then she jumps down from up here, and is completely fine. She then flips this first car over her head, which brings me to her strength in this episode. I can buy that Peggy as a super soldier is stronger than Steve as a super soldier, because Peggy at a base level is stronger than Steve at a base level, but she wouldn't be this much stronger to the point where she can just flip a car over herself with the shield. The shield is very strong, but that doesn't mean you will stay in place no matter what hits it. When Steve gets shot at with a grenade launcher, he's not experiencing as much force as his car would have after speeding up. Yet he flies backwards, he doesn't just stand there because the shield absorbed it. The shield can absorb impacts, but not perfectly. But okay, even if you're fine with this one because she flipped the car and didn't just stop it, which would have hit her with all the force, the next car runs into her head on as she runs towards it, and she stops it completely, which throws the two guys through the windshield, which shouldn't have happened as cleanly as it did considering the fact that if they fly forward they hit the dashboard. So this is definitely going to have more force than the grenade that sent Steve flying. There's no way she just stood there without moving. But now that those cars are out of the way, the bikes arrive, and the first one drives straight into her even though the guy in the sidecar has a gun, which allows her to knock the bike away with her shield. The next one shoots at her until she throws the shield and therefore no longer has a way to block bullets. Mighty convenient time to stop shooting. Then the third one comes up close again so the driver gets knocked off by Peggy. It's also really lucky that they're choosing to come in one at a time in spaced out intervals so that she never has to block bullets from two sides at once, because if that did happen, she would be dead. She says,
Are you seeing this?
to nobody at all, which is also way too joyful considering the current situation. Peggy is just joyfully killing people to the point where it's almost psychopathic, and it's certainly out of character. Peggy in the first Avenger was never like this. Even when she landed an incredibly impressive shot, she didn't celebrate, she just kept fighting seriously. But she isn't like this the majority of the time in this episode, so I'll spare her from the count. Then another bike comes in close so she can kick it, and then she throws it one-handed into another bike. She shouldn't be strong enough to throw it this far one-handed. Also, the group wasn't spaced out enough to be coming this far apart. So apparently there were soldiers in the truck that waited this long to actually come out of it. And when they do run up to Peggy, they don't actually shoot her, so they just get knocked out. The same happens to a bunch of guys who, despite having guns, turn the corner of the truck super tightly. Then after she knocks all of them out, we get more cringe dialogue.
Where have you been in my life?
Until a large guy comes up and says,
The Allies must be desperate, sending in a fragile Fraulein to fight for them.
when she just destroyed your entire crew, and there's flames everywhere. But sure, fragile. And I'm sure it's a good idea to fight her hand to hand. So she beats him up and it's incredibly cringe. Then she goes to find Zola and get the Tesseract from him. She brings the Tesseract back and asks Flynn to promote her to captain, because he says as an agent she isn't qualified for field duty. She says,
I trust you know what to do with that.
to Stark, and he responds,
Oh, I know exactly what to do with this.
which, how? You said earlier that,
The greatest minds alive can't fathom the extent of this battery's power.
so wouldn't it be dangerous for you to use it if you can't fathom the extent of its power? And you have no experience working with it. How do you know what to make already? And we'll come back to what he makes later. Peggy and Steve talk about going to get Bucky and the soldiers that got captured with him, and they end the conversation talking about a dance. Again, we'll come back to that. We see Peggy catch up to a motorcycle, which is a lot faster than we ever saw Steve run, and if she mounted it at full speed like this, there's no way it would have been that smooth. And when she runs up to the motorcycle, the driver just sits there stupidly and doesn't try to evade her or anything. She does the jump to break through the gate, but jumping like this isn't gonna work, no matter how strong you are. Her feet are still on the motorcycle. She can't push off the motorcycle to pull herself and the motorcycle into the air. She would need to push off the ground for that. After doing this, she just runs into a bunch of soldiers with the motorcycle and they don't try to shoot at her. Then she goes to the tower with the people that actually did decide to shoot at her, and jumps incredibly high, which still doesn't make any sense, then launches the motorcycle into the tower with perfect accuracy. The action in this episode is absolute nonsense. When she comes up to the 107th, 4 soldiers appear out of nowhere who she knocks out. Then she asks,
Are you the 107th? I'm here for Sergeant Barnes.
but why ask that now? You should get all of your soldiers freed from the base, then ask for Bucky later. Doing it now is just wasting time and giving Hydra more time to prepare to stop your exit. So they break out, and tanks come to shoot at them. Luckily, all of their tank shells land too far away, except for the one that goes directly towards Peggy so she can block it with the shield. Steve flies in with the new Hydra Stomper, which is incredibly powerful to the point of being basically indestructible. But I don't know what material Stark has that's that strong. The shield used up all the vibranium they had. They take out the tanks and reference dancing. Again. And when they're done and Steve shows his face, Bucky says,
Hold on, you can't even drive a car.
which makes it quite strange that Stark would hand off his greatest creation to one of the least qualified people to pilot it. Steve isn't experienced with fighting, and he isn't experienced with driving either. If anything goes wrong, like if the suit turns off, he doesn't have the strength to hold his own. Steve is a very bad choice to put in this thing. We then go to a montage which starts with Hydra soldiers walking right up to Peggy, not noticing her until she's an arm's distance away. And we don't see the full fight, but it's insane plot armor, as per usual with this episode, that Peggy doesn't get shot by any of these soldiers, especially considering that she throws the shield. If you shoot at her when she does that, she's dead. Flynn is on the phone taking credit for all the things he didn't do, which is not at all in character. This episode makes Flynn out to be a one-dimensional misogynist and a joke, but in the Agent Carter one-shot, he actually respected authority. Stark tells him to tell Agent Carter that she is going to run S.H.I.E.L.D. with him, and Stark adds that Flynn should say he's honored to give her this news. And despite how much you can tell he hates it, and despite the fact that Stark wouldn't really have a way to verify, and probably wouldn't care much anyway if he left out the being honored part, Flynn follows his orders verbatim.
Agent Carter, it is my honor to inform you that you are going to run S.H.I.E.L.D.
This man respects authority, even at a time when they wouldn't know if he fully did or not. He definitely would not lie to the President of the United States. We see Steve and Peggy fighting some Nazi planes, then we cut to a scene where the Nazi general comes in to inform Schmidt that
The Fuhrer demands your presence in Berlin!
which prompts this line from Schmidt,
But a god does not answer to a man.
which if you don't remember the first Avenger very well, might seem in character. Johann Schmidt is a man that sees himself as superior, and has a reason for it, as he was the world's very first super soldier. Let's take a look at his first scene in the movie, and in fact, it's the first scene that takes place during the World War II storyline in that movie, as opposed to the present day one. We open up to Tonsberg, I probably said that wrong, Norway, in March 1942. A man runs into a building as we hear gunfire and explosions in the distance. He enters, and him and another man have an exchange in Norwegian until the building starts rumbling. The two men are terrified, until the rumbling stops and a Hydra tank punches through the wall, killing the man who ran in and leaving the one who was already there. Alongside the tank, a strange-looking car drives up, which the camera zooms in to reveal has the Hydra emblem on it. The driver of this car steps out and enters the building. As he does so, 3 soldiers are trying to remove the top off of a casket. They are ordered to open it! Quickly before he gets... But they barely can move it at all, before the driver of the strange car arrives and everyone in the room stands at attention. This man is a Hydra general. His first line is,
"It has taken me a long time to find this place. You should be commended."
It's a compliment to the Norwegian man's ability to hide this location, but at the same time, through saying, "It has taken me a long time to find this place," it reveals that the general finds it commendable to hide something from him specifically for so long. He holds himself in high regard. He tells the soldiers to
help him up
so he can have a face-to-face conversation with this man.
"I think that you are a man of great vision, and in this way we are much alike."
This is how the general views himself, a man of great vision. It might seem like a trivial thing to point out, but it'll be important later. The Norwegian man's response is,
"I am nothing like you."
To which the general's response is,
"No, of course."
Both agreeing because of the reason this man is saying this. They are nothing alike in that they are on opposite sides of the war, directly opposing each other. But they are unlike in more ways than just this, as the general will reveal later. He follows up with,
"But what others see as superstition, you and I know to be a science."
Similar to one of the ideas presented by Thor, where science and magic aren't so different in this world where Asgardian mythology is real. Here, magic is just science that isn't understood yet. The Norwegian man retorts, saying,
"What you seek is just a legend."
Trying desperately to send the general off his path to finding it. But he simply responds,
"Then why make such an effort to conceal it?"
He is too smart to be convinced otherwise. The great lengths gone to hide this power must mean it's the real thing. With that, he pushes the top off the casket with ease, when 3 soldiers could barely get it to budge. Our first hint at the true nature of this general. And this reveals a corpse holding a blue cube. He tells everyone,
"The Tesseract was the jewel of Odin's treasure room."
Which may seem like it is simply expository dialogue, but rather it leads to him dropping the cube, shattering it on the floor as the soldiers watch in horror. And this statement about the Tesseract being the jewel of Odin's treasure room was merely to explain that
"It is not something one buries."
If it was hidden here, it wouldn't be because someone was buried with it. The Tesseract being out of use means it's hidden deliberately.
"But I think it is close, yes."
All of his searching has led up to this moment. An obvious decoy will not throw him off his path. The Norwegian man continues to fight back.
"I cannot help you."
But the general, so sure of his position and ready to take any measures to achieve his goal, responds,
"No. But maybe you can help your village."
The Norwegian man starts to catch on to what is being implied.
"You must have some friends out there, some little grandchildren, perhaps."
With each word, the Norwegian man's concern visibly grows.
"I have no need for them to die."
The tank takes aim, and the Norwegian man, without saying a word, finally gives in, motioning behind the general, as he turns around to see an ornately carved wall.
"Yggdrasil, tree of the world."
The general knows what he's talking about when it comes to this stuff, thus his certainty that the Tesseract is real will not be shaken.
"Guardian of wisdom and fate also."
As he says this, something on the wall catches his eye. A snake with an eye that looks like a button. He presses it and pulls the compartment out of the wall as the Norwegian man watches, terrified. He opens it up to look at what he came for, commenting,
"And the Führer digs for trinkets in the desert."
Referencing how the Nazis had a group of archaeologists to try to search for historical evidence that the Aryans were superior, but never found anything substantive and relied on propaganda as what they were looking for was a farce. He looks down on this futile effort, because right here he found what he was looking for, one of the greatest power sources in the world. His own search proved fruitful, while the digging in the desert turned up nothing. It brings up the parallels between himself as the leader of Hydra, and Hitler as the leader of the Third Reich. But while Hitler vainly searched for reasons to hold himself up as superior, the general already had those reasons and successfully just found one more. As he says later in the movie,
"Hydra could grow no further in Hitler's shadow."
And with what he has just found, he has surpassed Hitler's efforts and is truly ready to exit his shadow. He looks up to the man and, upon judging his reaction, concludes,
"You have never seen this, have you?"
To which the response is,
It's not for the eyes of ordinary men.
As this man believes the thing he has hidden and guarded for so long is so far beyond him that he could not once dare to look at it. The general concurs
Exactly.
before shutting the case. This could have just meant that he stopped looking at it because ordinary men weren't meant to see it, but there's more going on than that. This single word conveys exactly what the general thinks of himself. Ordinary men are not fit to gaze upon the Tesseract, but he is no ordinary man. He looked upon his finding and shut the case before taking it away, as he was the only one fit to see it. This is much like the earlier line where he agrees with the Norwegian man, but rather than for the same reason, it's because of his view of himself as superior. As he walks away, he commands,
Give the order to open fire.
as now that he found the Tesseract, keeping the town alive holds no leverage to him anymore. Instead, he will continue to conquer everything in his path. Instead of acknowledging this, the Norwegian man can only bring himself to say,
Fool! You cannot control the power you hold.
For so long, he has viewed the Tesseract as this object that is above mankind, such that nobody could ever properly wield it.
You will burn!
This is the danger it presents to one unfit to wield it. But the general sees himself as above that and disregards the warning.
I already have.
He has already suffered the effects of taking on a power with consequences, as we will see later in the movie. Thus, he is not scared of the effects of this one. He shoots the Norwegian man as his usefulness is gone, and as the tanks fire in the background, his face moves in a weird way. As he fixes it, the camera pans down to reveal the blood from the gunshot splattered onto the Hydra emblem on his jacket. And this shot, get it, is fantastic. Through the death of an ordinary man, the head of Hydra became a Red Skull. This scene is fantastic at hinting at the General's later reveal to be the Red Skull, and being the original super soldier. But his biggest strength is establishing the General as a character. Every line of dialogue has a purpose, as is the case with the majority of the first Avenger, and we get exactly who the General is from this scene. He is cold and calculating, as we see from his deductions and his decisions to keep the town and Norwegian man alive, until they had no use for him anymore, and he also subtly informs us what he thinks about himself. He is no ordinary man, but he doesn't go around parading it. It's merely a view he holds and makes decisions based off of. But what actually reveals his mindset is very subtle.
It has taken me a long time to find this place. You should be commended.
I am nothing like you.
No, of course.
It's not for the eyes of ordinary men.
Exactly.
And all of this is communicated without us even knowing his name yet. This truly was one marvelous scene. Johann Schmidt, and eventually the Red Skull, as he does act in different ways when he openly reveals himself to be the Red Skull, is a very well characterized villain in the first Avenger. Johann Schmidt views and refers to himself as a man, albeit a superior one. But once the mask comes off, he fully admits that
We have left humanity behind.
keep this view of himself in mind, as it will be important when comparing him to what he is like in What If. Let's take a look at the line that prompted this one more time.
But a god does not answer to a man.
It doesn't seem like much, but this line is a blatant failure to understand his character. Despite seeing himself as no ordinary man, he still sees himself as a man, or at least tells people that he's one. Even after revealing that he's the Red Skull, the farthest he goes is saying,
We have left humanity behind.
multiple times in the movie, he talks about wielding or harnessing the power of gods, but that's it. He doesn't once refer to himself as a god. Red Skull would never see himself as a god. Johann Schmidt would certainly never see himself as a god or say that he is to someone else, especially when he doesn't have the Tesseract, the only reason he mentions gods in the first Avenger anyway. He talks about summoning his champion, who we will get to later, and kills the Nazi guy because he is insulted by what Schmidt says. The rest of the things he says in this scene after that one line aren't out of character. In fact, there's one line I like from him, even if it's nothing special as a line. Just something he would actually say, and it was delivered well.
The Third Reich will fall, and Hydra will rise from its ashes.
But we're not done with the Red Skull just yet. The next scene is Steve and Peggy talking in a bar about what it's like to have the serum, and how they are each other's heroes. But before they can kiss, Stark shows up to tell them Bucky stole a jeep for them to ride in, and we cut to the next mission. Captain Carter and her crew are overlooking a train which their intel told them has the Red Skull on it. Steve goes up to the front of the train, then they all zipline down to it.
Woo! Thanks! You almost ripped my arm off!
Haha, very funny.
I've got a visual, but I'm going in for a closer look.
What? He's at the front of the train, which has no windows. How does he have a visual? So he goes inside and it's full of bombs, which he takes way too long to realize. Oh no. And it thus explodes the entire train. Everyone here just jumped off the back of the train and they were completely fine, because that makes sense. So they think Steve is dead, but they have to leave because an avalanche is starting. But Peggy got pulled off screen less than a second before the snow landed where she was standing, so surely they'd all just be wiped out by the avalanche, right? Well, they weren't, because everybody was fine. We cut to Flynn and Stark arguing, and their argument is pretty stupid.
You said that glowing ice cube could rewrite the laws of physics.
Yeah, and when was he proven wrong? Just because it got destroyed, supposedly, doesn't mean it can't rewrite the laws of physics. Then Flynn says,
You said the Hydra Stomper was indestructible.
To which Stark says,
It is! Was!
When that goes directly against it being indestructible. So shouldn't your response be, we don't know that it's actually destroyed, it could still be out there? Because if you truly believed it was indestructible, that's the only logical outcome. Not to say it was indestructible, when that's categorically impossible. Peggy cuts in with,
His name is Steve Rogers, not the Hydra Stomper.
Which is incredibly stupid, because Flynn was talking about the machine itself being indestructible. Peggy, do you think he meant Steve is indestructible? Because I'm pretty sure we all know that's not true. Peggy then storms off and goes to interrogate Zola, who talks his head off before Peggy even speaks a word.
Ah, Fräulein Carter. I was wondering when you might visit me. You're wasting your time. I will tell you nothing.
Which is very unlike him. In the first Avenger, he doesn't say a word to Phillips when he comes to interrogate him, until he is presented the stake. Then his first line isn't unnecessary rambling, it is instead a question.
What is this?
This is all we get from him the entire episode, other than being part of the transport of the Tesseract, which makes him therefore part of the planning of this incredibly stupid method of transport. So everything he does in this episode is out of character, another one to add to the list. And of course we cut to Peggy saying he told her everything, so that's just great. We get a vague overview of Red Skull's plan, but we'll hold off on talking about it until we see it actually happen. So they decide to storm the Hydra castle as revenge because they killed Steve, supposedly. We get more plot armor-riddled action, and we see they brought Howard without him even having a gun. The greatest scientific mind on your side of the war, maybe even the greatest on both sides, and you bring him here with no way to defend himself. Wow. We cut to Red Skull placing the Tesseract in a machine, and wait a second, the Hydra Stomper had the entire Tesseract in it? We know you can make Tesseract-based technology without putting the entire Tesseract in something. Why use the entire Tesseract on this one thing, both shutting you off from making more technology with it, and introducing the possibility of losing the entire Tesseract like you did here? That's a really stupid design choice. Great job, Howard. And wait a second, if Red Skull just got the Tesseract, how did he have all this technology in place to use it? How would he know how to design this if he didn't have its central component to design around? Bucky and the others find the Hydra Stomper, then we cut to Peggy and Stark running around until they find the room Red Skull is in, where Red Skull is summoning a tentacle monster with no precautions in place at all. So earlier in the part I skipped over, Peggy said that
Red Skull believes he can unleash an interdimensional force that will lead Hydra to world domination, and if that fails, world annihilation.
So Red Skull's plan was to summon this uncontrollable interdimensional tentacle monster and somehow use it to conquer the world? And if he couldn't conquer the world, he would destroy it? What? So first of all, there's no way he could use this to conquer because it just destroys everything in its path. Second of all, destroying the world does not align with Red Skull's motivations. In fact, it doesn't align with anyone's motivations. Ever.
Because I'm one of the idiots who lives in it!
Well, there are some exceptions, but Red Skull is not one of them. Not that this monster is really powerful enough to destroy the world anyway, but why have this as a plan B if it's not in your best interests at all? Third of all, this is not a thing. If this was his goal, he would have done it in the first Avenger. Remember when I pointed out the wall was different? This is why. They changed it to make it seem like his goal was to summon the tentacle monster the whole time, but it never was. This is the same character he was in the first Avenger. Upon getting the Tesseract, he would operate as he did in the first Avenger, not summon the power of anime to destroy the world. And of course, a short time after summoning it, it immediately goes for him and kills him because he has no precautions in place. We saw a bunch of soldiers here earlier, yet they're all gone when you probably should have kept them here in case things went wrong. Red Skull has absolutely handled the worst out of any character in this episode, and constitutes our very first assassination by proxy. Let's add him to the count. We cut back to the people at the Hydra Stomper, and they see Steve off-chained to the side of the room. Why didn't they kill him? He's so skinny and frail that he's not going to be useful in any way, and Hydra kills whoever isn't useful to them. They even sometimes kill the people who are useful to them.
I'm not sure they have the strength.
Then use up what strength they have left docked up. There are always more workers.
Unless they kept him alive to interrogate him, in which case, I don't know how that would be useful given their plan is just to release a tentacle monster upon the world. Well anyway, Steve asks to be put in the suit so they do it. It's also strange that Hydra found a way to work it without the Tesseract this quickly. So the suit falls out, but it's powered up now. So Steve flies through the ceiling to find Peggy, and we see the tentacle monster is still coming through the portal, which leads to Peggy saying,
"Its tentacles appear to be growing."
Yeah, thanks for the heads up, I'm sure nobody caught that. Then she says,
"At the rate it's spreading, it could devour Europe."
Do you know how big Europe is? And you know there's a creature on the other side, so surely there will be a point where the entire creature has come through and it'll be smaller than Europe. Stark says if he can get to the controls he can do some science stuff, so Peggy responds with,
"You mean transpose the polarity and reverse the suction?"
Which first of all, how does Peggy know what he's talking about? And second of all, that doesn't make sense anyway. There's no suction at the moment, the creature is just willingly coming through. So it's not reversing suction, it's inducing it. But even if there was suction, to reverse it you would have to reverse the polarity, whatever that means. Basically the suction is going to be caused by an imbalance of some sort between the two sides of the portal, and you'd have to reverse it, not transpose it. What I just said may sound like nonsense, but what Peggy said is even more nonsense. So she jumps Howard over to the controls, but he can't tell what's what because it's all in German. Then the creature slams her into the wall in a spot that just so happens to be an arm's length away from a decorative sword, that just so happens to be an actual sword, that's strong enough to cut through this tentacle monster from space. How convenient. So she cuts the tentacle, but gets grabbed again, and the sword is apparently strong enough to cut through the stone floor, and Howard manages to reverse the suction, I guess, and the creature starts getting pulled through the portal. When Steve comes back, Howard says,
"I told you it was indestructible!"
But upon Steve getting hit by a tentacle and the energy going down, he responds with,
"You were saying, Howard!"
I don't think the people in this episode know what indestructible means. They seem to think things other than the Hydra Stomper being destroyed is proof that it isn't indestructible. But, it didn't get destroyed. And that's what indestructible means. The creature still manages to come through, and its scream hurts everyone's ears, and starts to make the building fall apart, so Steve gets everyone out of there. And now Howard can't close the portal because the creature is holding the portal open. What? Portals aren't a physical thing you can grab onto. It's infinitely thin, and doesn't physically exist. It's just a connection point between two spots in space. So because it's holding the portal open, Peggy goes to push it back through the portal. This entire tentacle monster. She's strong enough to push this entire thing back. Yeah, sure, that makes perfect sense, even though a single tentacle could hold her easily. And no tentacles come around from the side to hit or grab her either, it just lets her push it. Steve comes to help, but the Hydra Stomper runs out of power, so Steve crawls out of it and tries to convince Peggy, and they bring up dancing. Again. But she decides to go through with it, pushing the monster through, allowing the portal to close, and causing a giant explosion that destroys the controls in most of the room. But Steve was fine because he covered his head with his hands. Yeah, Steve should definitely be dead considering the damage that this explosion did and the fact that he wasn't behind any cover at all. When we cut away from there, we see the Tesseract and the machinery that we see it in at the start of Avengers. It opens up a portal and out come cut up pieces of tentacles and... Peggy? So she somehow single-handedly beat this monster, or at least escaped it. She turns around to see Nick Fury and Hawkeye. After Fury tells her to put down the sword, Hawkeye excitedly says to Fury,
"Sir, that's Captain Carter."
So his first and only line in this episode is out of character. First of all, Nick Fury is one of the most knowledgeable people in the world when it comes to superheroes. This well-known hero's identity doesn't need to be told to him. Also, it's not like Hawkeye to be cheerful and excited like this. He's a very serious person and would be alert and ready because he has no idea if this is the real Captain Carter and doesn't know what she's going to do. Same for Nick Fury, both of them seem to just accept that this is the real Captain Carter with no proof. Fury is questionable, but I'll only add Clint to the out of character count because Fury other than this makes sense, while Clint's only line is out of character. Peggy asks,
"Where's Steve Rogers?"
So Fury says,
"The war ended almost 70 years ago."
So the Tesseract brought her forward almost 70 years. That makes sense, considering it has the time stone inside of it. Oh wait, what were they thinking? The Tesseract just randomly sends her forward a large amount of time when its only uses are being a power source and teleportation. This is actual nonsense. They had the exact same setup in Avengers, and it brought Loki in, except he was not transported across time, because that's not how the Tesseract works. And come to think of it, how did it activate here in an empty room? Nobody's here operating the machinery to turn it on. It just randomly brought Captain Carter through time. And why are Nick Fury and Hawkeye randomly standing here at this moment when nobody else is in the room? Basically nothing in this scene makes sense. Then we zoom out as the Watcher talks about how these are stories that he observes.
But I do not, cannot, will not interfere.
Which we will come back to much later in the series. Well, it's over at least. A lot of people would probably use the short length to excuse the shallowness of the characters, but go watch the Agent Carter one-shot. It does both Peggy and Flynn better than this episode, and it's only 15 minutes long. Speaking of Peggy, let's finally take a look at the references to dancing. In the first Avenger, there were 2 conversations between Steve and Peggy where dancing was brought up. The first one was in the car, where Steve mentions it and they talk about it, ending their conversation on this idea of the right partner. And as the story goes on, Steve realizes that Peggy is the right partner. But dancing isn't brought up again until the very end, where they talk about the dance to keep their minds off of what is happening, scheduling a date and time for the dance to stay optimistic and pretend that Steve is going to make it out of this. The dance was their relationship that never got to happen because Steve went under. And it's what keeps their minds off of this grim moment. The weight comes with how this is barely mentioned in the movie, merely this one setup introducing the idea, and the payoff where it makes sense for them to talk about it in this moment as a sort of distraction. In the What If episode, which is a quarter of the length, the dancing is brought up 4 times, and the parallel doesn't even exist here. It's just clunkily thrown in at first.
I never was much of a dancer anyway.
Maybe you haven't found the right partner.
When the car conversation already happened because it was before Peggy's different choice, thus there's no maybe about it. He said he was waiting for the right partner. Then they repeatedly bring up the topic of Steve owing Peggy a dance because she is willing to save his friend. And when Steve arrives with the Hydra Stomper, they say,
Stark made me some new dancing shoes. What do you think?
Well, then we better start dancing.
So here the dance they talk about did happen, taking away it being a parallel to their relationship that they never got to have. At the end, Steve says,
"You owe me a dance lesson,"
which was never a thing, and Peggy says,
"Yes, Saturday night,"
which fulfills kind of the same purpose as the final time they talk about it in the first Avenger, I guess, but there's no through line. Their talks about dancing aren't meaningful character interactions with more going on behind the lines. It's merely something they keep clunkily calling back to for no particular reason. Peggy and Steve aren't really damaged in this episode, like some other characters, aside from Peggy being weirdly joyful killing people. But they, along with everyone else, have been flattened. Most of the substance of every character is gone, without so much of a hint to it still being there, besides references that fail to grasp the more complex things actually going on in the first Avenger. The dialogue in the first Avenger is sharp and very well written, but the dialogue in this episode is awful. There are tons of unnatural, unnecessary, or just flat out stupid or out of character lines, which really hinder every character in the episode to being either stupid or just flat. Just as a reminder, the characters who were out of character in this episode were Erskine, Flynn, Stark, Zola, and Clint. And while they were fumbled, no character was handled quite as poorly as the Red Skull. Our first assassination by proxy. I never really cared about the Red Skull that much, until I rewatched the first Avenger to check for continuity errors with this episode, and realized how interesting he was compared to this version of the character, and just how much they got wrong. Red Skull in the first Avenger was an evil man, but he wasn't a cartoonishly evil idiot. He was simply a man who thought he was superior because of his superhuman abilities, and thus had little care for the lives of others should they impede his goal for Hydra, under his command, to take over the planet. Upon finding the Tesseract, he would use it to create technology advanced enough that nobody could stand a chance against Hydra, and he would instill terror until everywhere was under his command. Despite his high view of himself, he would never think of himself as a god, and surely would never refer to himself that way, merely a superior man harnessing the power of gods. In What If, he loses the Tesseract due to an idiotic escort of it that was way underarmed, then goes on to refer to himself as a god anyway, despite not having what he refers to as the power of the gods in the first Avenger. And his final plan is, instead of creating technology for his armies to use and thus he could have complete control over the forces he uses to conquer, to summon an uncontrollable tentacle monster with no safety precautions or regard for his own life whatsoever, and promptly gets crushed. His plan B was to allow it to destroy the entire world, which doesn't align with anything he wanted in the first Avenger. What a waste of a fantastic villain. They completely ruined him. The characters in this episode aren't the worst in the world, but they're a bit below average mostly, with Red Skull really dragging it down. The plot? Oh boy. So all the action in this episode is nonsense, and what connects the action scenes is pretty awful as well. The episode entirely relies on a ton of continuity errors and just stupid things for it to work, and just hopes you don't remember that they're different. All the people were down here when in the first Avenger they had already gone upstairs to the booth, so Philip shouldn't have died, and Flynn shouldn't have been put in his place. There's no way they would have been allowed to stay down here anyway. They can't make more super soldiers because the 7th vial that should be here doesn't exist. The only reason Peggy can get the Tesseract and prove herself to be useful is because Hydra gets the Tesseract much later than they should have, and transports it with very little security and slow enough that she can catch up to them when they're already most of the way to their destination. Then Hydra is able to get the Tesseract back, because Stark for some reason put the entire Tesseract inside of the Hydra Stomper, instead of creating Tesseract-based technology like we see in the first Avenger. Then they go to get the Tesseract back, and somehow Hydra quickly built machinery to use it and stupidly summoned a tentacle monster that they couldn't control. The rest of the episode is complete nonsense, but the standout parts of the nonsense were incredibly convenient and strong sword, the creature physically holding the portal open, Peggy managing to push the monster back, the explosion doing absolutely nothing to Steve, and the Tesseract randomly sending Peggy far forward in time when that's not even remotely close to its function, and she ends up in a room with Nick Fury and Hawkeye in it, but nobody else for some reason. The plot is broken on so many levels, both as a standalone and with the context of how many continuity errors it has with the first Avenger. There's not really much world building in this episode because the world has already been built for us, it's just one different thing that happened. The world building it does do is introducing us to the concept of timelines being created by a single different choice, but it screws that up anyway because of all the continuity errors from before that one choice. The Watcher is world building too, but we learn very little about him. We will get to looking deeper into the nature of his existence later in the series. And the tentacle monster is world building, I guess. A random tentacle monster that exists somewhere with breathable air, because Peggy survives it, and also is weak enough to be cut by a normal sword and pushed back by Peggy. Very cool. The slivers of world building we get aren't so great. Captain America: The First Avenger isn't a flawless movie. It has its fair share of plot armor and some other minor plot issues, but it's way better than this. Everything good in the first Avenger is ruined, gone, or bland, and its problems are amplified to the highest degree. The plot armor and plot problems are far greater in What If Episode 1, and the characters are way worse. Based on the crippling problems, nonsense, character damage, and lack of substance in this episode, my score for it will be a 2 out of 10. Maybe 3 out of 10 if I'm feeling generous, but for now I'm sitting at a 2 out of 10. This episode isn't worth watching. Go watch Captain America: The First Avenger instead. Or go watch the best animated Marvel show to come out in 2021, Hitmonkey. Or even better, stay tuned as I continue the series on the worst animated Marvel show ever made. I'm gonna rank the episodes as we go along, so for now this episode is of course, number 1 out of 1. The best so far, also the worst so far. Well, that's all I have for you today. And as always, thanks for watching.